hobby of collecting comic books. Those of you who have not, do not know that, but you all will be spared from hearing about that topic again. However, I'm going to tell you about another hobby I have, and yes, I do have other hobbies. This kind of shares the same history as my collection of comic books, but took a divergent path along the way, which I'll describe to you in my speech. Fellow Toastmasters and many welcome guests, I would like to introduce you to the wonderful world of, especially this Halloween season, collecting monster magazines. I mentioned that I have a similar history with monster magazines as I do with comics. It's because I grew up reading both. Comic books, though, are different than monster magazines. They're fictional stories. They have characters and story arcs that continue. And while I started collecting them as a child, I continued for almost 40 years and still collect those to this day. But monster magazines are a little different. They're nonfiction. They're articles about horror movies and monster movies, and it was very easy to slip in and out of collecting those. In fact, my passion for collecting these has really just rekindled in the last probably 10 years or so. So it was an old hobby that has recently come to the surface. For you to understand this hobby, I need to give you a history of the medium and monster magazines. I'm going to do it in a kind of odd way. I'm going to start in the mid-70s, and I'm going to tell you about an evolution that occurred with monster magazines. Doing that so that I compare how they started out and what they used to be like. And then I'm going to explain and demonstrate for you my hobby. How do I research them, how do I collect them, and how do I track them? As the example for all of this, we're going to start with the granddaddy of all monster magazines, Famous Monsters of Filmland. It started in 1958 as a publication focusing on horror movies and monsters. But in the mid-70s, a little movie came out called Star Wars, and that changed the whole aspect of all types of publishing. So instead of magazines with monsters on the cover, we got magazines with creatures and robots from science fiction. So I think this is probably one reason I kind of lost interest in collecting. I was really all about the monsters. And then about 10 years later, in the 80s, horror movies changed in general. They became more gory and bloody, and the monsters were Freddy Krueger or Jason from Friday the 13th. So the whole sensibility of horror changed. And Famous Monsters tried to keep up with it, but they really just didn't have it. And in fact, in 1983, it ceased publication. And in its place, new magazines rose up. For example, Fangoria, which was all about the blood and gore. Famous Monsters did experience several revivals over the years, and in fact, it's being published now. But I want to show you what an issue looks like now compared to its original incarnation. So this is a recent issue, cover price $9.99. It's got glossy cover, very thick paper, shiny and colorful all throughout, lengthy, in-depth articles, more really of a book than a magazine. Now here's an issue that came out in 1967. Still a color cover, not quite as thick and glossy, but the contents are black and white. Not as lengthy of articles. And cover price, does anyone want to guess?
50 cents.
50 cents, correct. Now, Famous Monsters was created in 1958 by a man named Forrest J. Ackerman, also known as Uncle Forey. And his angle on the whole thing was these pictures were largely from his personal collection. And the captions he wrote had really bad puns to them. But that was the style of Famous Monsters. And really the audience for Famous Monsters is a group called Monster Kids. Monster Kids are children that grew up in the 50s and 60s, and they were being exposed to the classic monster movies of the 30s and 40s for the first time in a new medium called television. So these were very popular with the monster kids in the 50s and 60s. I was a monster kid. I remember going to bed on a Friday night, setting my alarm clock for midnight so that I could get up and watch the late night creature feature. I loved those old Universal horror movies, monster movies, and I loved Famous Monsters. But I think as I grew up and went to college and started weeding out my collection, I had to decide what stays and what goes. my monster magazines were, I kept my comic books. So my hobby now is, again, different from comic books. I'm not so much purchasing new issues. I'm trying to find the issues from my childhood, from my past. Because of that, I have to take a little bit different approach. I can remember some specific issues I owned, but I really don't know what all is available out there. Therefore, with the proliferation of the internet, there is a wonderful site called moviemags.com, and this isn't just monster magazines, it's any type of movie magazine. If I type in famous monsters, I will get a list of every issue of Famous Monsters of Filmland. It's kind of nice because it has a picture of each magazine. What I don't like about it is it doesn't show the content. I really wish it said what articles were in there. But at this point, I'm pretty much just buying it for the cover anyway, thinking there will be a story behind that cover that I would want to read. So I see what is available, and then I need to, this doesn't also give a value. So I go to our friend eBay and I look up, and right now I have a holy grail of a Famous Monsters. That's the one issue I really want. It's number 82. On the cover is House of Dark Shadows. It's one of my favorite horror movies based on one of my favorite TV shows, Dark Shadows. So I go to eBay, I type in Famous Monsters 82. Now look at this. Look at these prices. Ranges from $40 to $125. Now I really want this magazine, but I'm not only not going to pay it, I can't pay that for one of those issues. So when I go out to different towns, I look at comic shops, flea markets. I keep a list, my wish list, in an application called Evernote. Everything that I want, so that I always have it with me. There's an app on the phone. And if I find something, I can check it off. So Famous Monsters 82 is on my list there. And guess what? I was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania 2 weeks ago, and I found Famous Monsters number 82. Nice. For a steal, $20. Believe me, that's a bargain and something that I snatched up immediately. When I buy a new issue, I bag and board it. These are boards that are on one side are slick. You put that behind the magazine, slide it into a protected bag. And then you can tape the top and store it in a storage box. I mentioned that the Movie Mag site does not have a content list. So what I do when I buy a magazine and I look through it, I have a spreadsheet that I've created, and I list the magazine. This is all one magazine, but I've put what's on the cover, the year, the cover price, etc., and I'll list the articles. One day I hope to turn this into a legitimate database where I could actually search by articles and then find different magazines that have an article I want to read. That is pretty much my hobby. I believe I have told you about the evolution of monster magazines in the 70s and 80s. I've told you how they began and what the audience was, and then I've explained the particulars of my hobby. It's something I'm enjoying very much now, reliving the nostalgia of my youth. I enjoy it very much. I'm glad I got to share it with you. Happy Halloween.